The dust rolled across the wide street of Dry Creek like a restless spirit, settling on the wooden porches, the wheels of wagons, and the worn boots of men who had seen too much hardship in their days. And on this particular afternoon, it carried with it the cries of a woman who had already lost more than her share to the cruelty of life. For Mary Ellen, the widow with tired eyes and trembling hands, had dropped to her knees in the dirt as her little girl was, being pulled away by the callous grip of a hired hand working for the local banker, her voice breaking as she cried, "Please don't take my child away," the plea echoing across the town so raw, so filled with agony, that even the horses tethered to the hitching post seemed unsettled, stamping their hooves as though they, too, could feel the unbearable pain that laced her voice. Yet the men who watched did not move, for in Dry Creek fear had long ruled more powerfully than compassion, and every man knew that crossing the banker meant trouble. Trouble that could ruin a family, burn a ranch to the ground, or cost a man his life. So though their hearts ached, their feet remained still, their eyes downcast, unwilling to stand in the path of power. And so Mary Ellen wept, clutching at the hem of the hired man's trousers until he kicked her hand away, his face hard, unmoved by her begging. For to him this was just a job, a task given to see that the banker's will was done, and the banker's will was always done. But little Anna, no more than 6, screamed for her mother, her tiny hands straining against the man's grip, her cheeks streaked with tears, her small voice hoarse with terror as she cried, "Mama, don't let them take me." And the sound struck through the air like the crack of a whip, tearing at the hearts of those who heard it, yet still no one moved. No one except the tall figure who leaned against the post outside the saloon, silent as he often was, his shadow stretching across the dust like something carved of stone, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat, his jaw tight, his silence deep and unbroken. For this was a man known to many but understood by few, a man who carried the weight of old battles in his step and the kind of grief that locked words behind his teeth, a rancher whose land lay on the outskirts of town, who had never asked for help nor given any, but whose presence carried a quiet authority that even the roughest men took care not to test. And as Mary Ellen's cries filled the air, he shifted, not much, just enough to lift his head, just enough for his eyes, gray as storm clouds, to fix on the scene before him. And though no one could read his thoughts, something passed through his gaze like a spark catching dry tinder, something dangerous and steady, the kind of spark that could change the course of the moment. For in a town where words were cheap and oaths were broken, silence was a power all its own, and his silence was beginning to weigh heavier than the banker's threats, heavier even than the fear that kept the other men rooted where they stood. And Mary Ellen, though lost in her despair, felt something shift in the air, a stillness that told her she was not entirely alone, though she could not yet see the hand that fate was dealing, for in her mind all she could feel was the shattering of her world, the memory of her husband buried in a shallow grave after a winter fever had stolen him, the endless nights of hunger, and the days of labor in the fields that could not keep pace with the banker's demands. And now, worst of all, the horror of losing her child, her only reason for enduring, her last tie to love itself, being torn from her arms while men stood idle, watching, their silence a condemnation, their indifference a wound as sharp as any knife. And so she cried, begged, clawed at the dust, her voice breaking into something rawer than words, a mother's primal scream, until even the hired man pulling Anna hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if for the first time questioning whether this task was worth it, whether any child should be ripped from her mother's arms like this. But the banker, standing on the porch of his office with a cigar clenched between his teeth in his belly, straining against his vest, barked, "Do it, or I'll find someone else who will." And the hesitation evaporated, duty overtaking doubt. Yet just then the silent rancher stepped forward, his boots sinking into the dust with a slow, deliberate rhythm that drew every eye, each step heavy with intent, and the crowd stirred, whispers breaking the silence as men nudged one another, murmuring his name, voices carrying fragments of old stories, of men he had faced down, of feuds he had ended, of the way he fought with the patience of stone and the fury of wildfire. And though he said nothing, though his face remained unreadable, his presence was suddenly the loudest thing in that street, louder even than Mary Ellen's sobs, louder than the banker's orders, louder than the desperate cries of little Anna. For silence, when carried by the right man, could drown out the world. And as he came to stand between the widow and the hired man, his shadow falling over them like a shield. Something inside Mary Ellen broke in a different way. Not with despair this time, but with the faintest flicker of hope, fragile and trembling but real. And she lifted her tear-streaked face, her lips trembling as she whispered not to the hired man, not to the banker but to him, to the man who had spoken no word, who had made no promise, yet who had stepped forward when no one else dared. And in that whisper was the kind of faith that rises only when a soul has been crushed to dust and still dares to believe, the kind of faith that turns strangers into saviors. And her whisper carried on the wind, soft but unyielding, "Please." And though he gave no answer, though his mouth did not open, the weight of his silence was all the answer. The town needed, and the chapter of Dry Creek's history was about to be rewritten, not by speeches, not by threats, but by the step of a rancher who had finally chosen to break his silence not with words, but with action. And in that moment, every man watching knew that something was about to happen that they would speak of for years to come, something that would turn this dusty street into the place where fear met its reckoning, where cruelty met resistance, and where a widow's desperate cry was answered not by mercy from those in power, but by the quiet strength of a man who had lost too much to stand by and let another life be broken before his eyes. And as this moment hung in the air, heavy and breathless, dear listener, if you've been drawn into Mary Ellen's pain and the silent rancher's resolve, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of the story and many more tales that will grip your heart and soul. The street of Dry Creek seemed to hold its breath as the silent rancher stood there, the dust swirling around his boots, the sun glaring down mercilessly from above, and every eye in town fixed upon him as though he were some unmovable mountain that had suddenly risen from the ground, and for the first time in years, perhaps ever, the hired hand who gripped Anna felt his own strength falter, his palm slick with sweat despite the tightness of his hold on the child, for the rancher's gray eyes bored into him without a word, without a single twitch of expression, and yet that silence spoke more clearly than any threat could, telling him that to take one more step with the girl would be to step into a storm he could not hope to weather. And the man swallowed hard, his heart pounding, glancing back at the banker as if to seek some reinforcement, some authority to draw upon. But the banker, though puffed up and scowling on the porch, shifted uneasily as well, for even he, in all his arrogance, knew that this rancher was not a man easily pushed aside, not a man who bent to bluster or bribes, for his land was his own, his life lived on his own terms, and in his silence lay a defiance deeper than any oath. And so the banker barked louder, his voice cracking. "What are you standing there for?" "Take the girl," I said, trying to mask his unease with anger. But the words rang hollow against the stillness that followed, for the rancher finally moved. Not with haste, not with fury, but with that same deliberate calm that made men uneasy, his hand lowering slowly to his side, brushing against the holster at his hip, not drawing, not yet, but making it clear that should this moment tip, should cruelty persist one heartbeat longer, steel would speak, and the hired hand, caught between the orders of the banker and the weight of the rancher's presence, felt his grip falter. Anna wrenching her little arm free, with a sudden burst of strength born of terror and hope, stumbling into her mother's arms where Mary Ellen clutched, her tight sobbing into her hair as if to breathe her back into her very soul, and the rancher stood before them like a wall, his broad shoulders squared, his silence declaring no further. The crowd, which had been nothing but spectators, now shifted. Men who had once kept their eyes down now looking up, meeting one another's gaze, something stirring in them, something like courage, for they saw in the rancher the thing they had long lost, the will to resist. And though no one spoke, though no one moved, the air itself seemed to hum with possibility, the heavy chains of fear beginning to loosen link by link. The banker, however, would not yield, his pride too swollen, his greed too entrenched, and he stomped down the steps of his porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight, his cigar clenched tight between yellowed teeth as he spat into the dust, snarling, "You think you can defy me, rancher? You think your silence frightens me? This woman owes me, this land owes me, and I'll take what I'm owed, even if I have to drag the girl through hell to get it." His voice boomed, but behind it was a quiver, a tremor, for he knew the line he was crossing, the danger he was courting, and yet his arrogance propelled him forward, as arrogance so often does, blind to the storm gathering at his feet, and still the rancher did not speak. His eyes locked on the man with a weight that seemed to strip away his bluster, exposing the smallness of him beneath the fine vest and cigar smoke. Until finally the banker, driven mad by the silence, drew a pistol from his belt, waving it with a trembling hand as he shouted, "I'll shoot you where you stand." The crowd gasped, the widow screamed, clutching Anna tighter. And for one suspended second the whole world balanced on the edge of violence, the hot wind carrying with it the scent of gun oil and fear. But then the rancher moved, quicker than thought, smoother than any man watching could follow. His own revolver drawn and leveled before the banker could even steady his aim. The metallic click of the hammer pulled back, echoing across the street like thunder. And though not a word passed his lips, the message was clear. Fire that gun, and it will be the last thing you do. The banker froze, his face paling, sweat dripping down his temple as the weight of his own mortality pressed down on him. And for the first time in his life, he looked into the eyes of a man who could not be bought, could not be cowed, and knew that he had already lost. For though the rancher said nothing, his silence roared louder than any bullet, his stillness more terrifying than any shout. And in that moment the balance of power shifted, the town itself seeming to realign. The crowd inching closer, men who had been beaten down by years of debts and threats now daring to step forward, their boots crunching in the dust as they moved behind the widow and her child, standing straighter than they had in years. And the banker, seeing it, feeling his grip slip on the town he had strangled for so long, lowered his gun with a trembling hand, muttering curses under his breath, retreating step by step until he stumbled back onto the porch, glaring at the rancher with hatred, but unable to muster the courage to fire. And in that retreat, in that collapse of arrogance, Dry Creek changed. For one man's silence had broken the spell of fear that had bound them all, and Mary Ellen, clutching Anna against her breast, lifted her tear-streaked face to the rancher, whispering through her sobs, "Thank you. Thank you," though she knew no thanks could truly touch the depth of what he had done. For he had not only saved her child but given her back her dignity, her hope, and in the hearts of all who watched, a seed had been planted. The seed of resistance, the seed of community, for they saw now that even in the face of power, they were not helpless if they stood together. And though the rancher said nothing, though he simply holstered his weapon and turned his gaze back to the horizon as though this were nothing but another day, his silence remained. A silence that spoke of battles fought and scars carried. A silence that told them all he did not act for gratitude or glory, but because some lines should never be crossed. And a mother's cry was one of them. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon and the town slowly returned to life, whispers spread in every home, every saloon, every bunkhouse. Whispers of the rancher who had faced down the banker. Whispers of Mary Ellen's cry and the child who was saved. And those whispers grew into something more, into plans, into unity, into a courage they had forgotten they possessed. And in the days to come, Dry Creek would rise, no longer a town bent beneath the will of one greedy man, but a place where voices joined, together could make even the cruelest tremble. And though the rancher remained silent, his actions had spoken for him louder than any sermon, louder than any law, and Mary Ellen, tucking her daughter into bed, knew that she had witnessed not just the saving of her child, but the rebirth of her town. And though her heart still ached with the memory of her husband, it now beat with a new strength, a new fire, one born of hope and courage. And as she closed her eyes that night, she whispered a prayer not of despair but of gratitude. Gratitude for a man who had stepped forward when no one else dared, a man whose silence had roared like thunder, and though she knew he would ride back to his lonely ranch with no expectation of thanks, she also knew that his name, his shadow, and his silence would live forever in the heart of Dry Creek. And dear listener, if this story gripped your heart, if Mary Ellen's fight and the silent rancher's courage stirred something deep within you, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more tales of love, loss, and unyielding courage await you. Stories that will make you feel every beat, every breath, every silence,